Good evening, and thank you for joining us as we continue our study of Paul's second epistle to the Corinthians. Tonight we are going to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 7 through 18. And joining us as usual is Ken Chapman from Orlando, Florida. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good, Jonathan. Good to be with you again.
Well, this is a section that has a lot of imagery, and so I'm sure it will spark a number of comments, probably between the both of us, off the cuff comments. So let's just go ahead and dig into the text as we kind of wrestle with the point that Paul's making and why Paul is making this point and what's going on in this passage. Ken, do you mind reading this first section of tonight's text for us?
2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. Now, if the ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. Indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all because of the glory that surpasses it. For if what was being brought to an end came with glory, much more will what is permanent have glory.
So we connect this text to last week's discussion. We back up just one verse to verse 6 when he talks about being ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And so he kind of introduces this division, this contrast between the old and the new ministry, the old and the new covenant. And that's what he's really going to be expanding upon through the rest of this chapter. And Ken, maybe we should just go ahead and address it here. Why make this point here? Up to this time, we've been talking about specifically Paul's work with the Corinthian church and about why he does things the way he does things. And now all of a sudden he's making an argument that he makes in Romans, he makes in Galatians, that the Hebrew writer makes in the book of Hebrews. Ken, did we, to use your language that you used a minute ago, did we drift off a little bit and wake up in the middle of a sermon when the preachers moved on? What do you think's happening here?
There may be more obvious explanations than I'm aware of, but I can only come up with two. Number one is that Paul, since he is a preacher, kind of got sidetracked and went off on a tangent. We know preachers. I know, Jonathan, you and I never do that. No. Some other preachers maybe want to do that. And so, I mean, it's possible that Paul has done that. There's nothing, in some sense, nothing wrong with that. One thought, him talking about the letters of commendation, not engraved in stones, kind of spurred this thought. And hey, that made me think of something. Let me talk about this for a minute, and then I'll get back to what I was talking about. That's a possibility. I think there's another possibility. I don't know that I have any historical evidence to back this up, but Paul in 2 Corinthians is going to be talking about his detractors, his opponents there at Corinth and maybe other places. And so is it possible that his opponents there in Corinth are these Judaizing teachers who are wanting to hold on to the old law and parts of it? And so Paul kind of gives kind of a backhanded, brush off to them in not just defending himself against their opponents, against their accusations, but also in dealing with kind of the root of their fallacy of holding on to the old law. Just a possibility.
Right. Yeah, I think we can understand the section without knowing exactly how it, plugs in with what's going on here. But I'm going to agree with you here. I think that's probably the best explanation I've heard and seen of what Paul is doing in this text. Regardless, he is going to use some great imagery here, and we can use our imaginations as we dig into this a little bit. And as he refers to this old covenant, he calls it a ministry of death. And it may be similar to some of the things he says over in Romans about how the law couldn't fix sin. It could only point it out. So we have that idea. He's going to talk about it being carved in letters of stone. And that's just a picturesque image of going back to the Ten Commandments, Mount Sinai, obviously, and summarizing the entirety of the law. And he says that if this ministry of death, this old covenant, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory. And this is just a reference back to Exodus chapter 34. You'll remember when Moses asked to see God. This is after the golden calf incident. And I think Moses is maybe a little bit afraid that God's about to ditch them in the desert. And God is very angry. Moses has stepped into the breach to keep God from just wiping them all out. And he says, show me your glory. And God says, well, you can't see it. If you see it in its totality, you'll die. And he says, but what I'll do is I'll put you in the cleft of the rock over here. I'll pass by. You can see kind of what remains as I pass by. And we know from that time on, Moses' face shone so brightly that the people couldn't look at him. He had to have a veil that he would take off when he went to speak with the Lord. So that's kind of that background to this imagery here. And that's going to be kind of in the back of Paul's mind as he makes this contrast between the old and the new. And so what he says is that this old covenant came with glory. We know that from what happened with Moses. But it was being brought to an end. And if the ministry that was being brought to an end came with glory, how much more will the ministry of the Spirit have glory? And so what we have here is an argument, the lesser to the greater. If this, then this. And Ken, I couldn't help but think of Hebrews 2, 2 and 3, Hebrews 10, 28, 29, Hebrews 2, 2 and 3 read, and you know this, for since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? If the old law came with retribution, what on earth do you think is going to happen if you neglect this new covenant, this new promise? Ken, any thoughts or comments thus far?
Well, what I'm hearing is you making an argument for Paul being the author of the book of Hebrews. I didn't know we were going there, but no, you're right. It's the exact same argumentation. We know what happened with that old covenant. We know the glory that it received. We know the punishment that was enacted upon the violators of that. How much more? And the comparison, we haven't got there. We did in our reading, but not in our discussion here. That which was brought to an end is being compared to what is permanent coming later. Really, we would say the temporary versus the permanent.
Right.
And if it received that glory, then what about that gospel? And this kind of ties it back into chapter 2, who leads us in glorious triumph of the gospel. What glory will it receive from God? How great is it? So,
just out of curiosity, not to open a can of worms, do you think that Paul wrote Hebrews? Not trying to put you on the spot. I was just curious.
No, I'm somewhat of an agnostic
right.
about that. I don't know. I hear all the arguments. It sure seems like it.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things, just as a country bumpkin preacher, that sounds like something Paul would write. So that's usually where I land up.
You heard it first here, ladies and gentlemen. Ken Chapman is an agnostic. All right. He continues this contrast between the old and the new, these two ministries. He talks about the glory associated with this ministry of condemnation. And that's kind of his emphasis here. And then he's going to compare it to this ministry of righteousness. And so if the ministry of condemnation, how bad does that sound? If it had glory, well, then of course the ministry of righteousness has more glory. We're still arguing from the lesser to the greater here. In just a moment, we'll make that point very clear. What once had glory has come to have no glory at all. because of the glory that surpasses it. So Ken, if you're in a dark room and you get out your phone to light up the to see something, well, that light can be very helpful. But when somebody comes and flips on the switch, you barely see that light anymore, if at all. Now, Paul would have no clue what we're making with this analogy here. And so I can't help but think of what Jesus says in Luke 14. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father or mother or wife, child, brother, sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now, we know from other passages that Jesus would not tell us to hate those people in our lives, but it's a comparison that we love Jesus so much that it outweighs or outshines that love that we have for these others. And so that's kind of the point that he's making here.
One way I like to think of it is, imagine these people, the Israelites, at the foot of the mountain, who saw Moses with that glory, even though it was covered with a veil, that they could see maybe a glow of that heavenly sunburn that he had coming out of that, and how in awe they were of that. Mm-hmm. and how impressed they must have been by the glory of God. If you could instantly transport them from that scene to the Mount of Transfiguration,
yes,
and then seeing Jesus, they'd have went, oh, well, that wasn't a glow at all. Right. This is, and to me, that's kind of the idea of it had glory, but in comparison to the new, no, that's not glory. This is glory.
Well, let's whittle on the Spirit's end of the stick a little bit, and obviously I'm doing that. Why do you think Paul doesn't is it just so obvious here? Or do you think maybe there's a reason he doesn't reference the transfiguration? Peter does in his epistle when he talks about it. I don't know. I just find maybe because Paul wasn't there. He doesn't, he didn't have that, the luxury of using that picture like Peter and John could.
That's certainly a possibility. Also, Paul's emphasizing really the word, the covenant, not the one who sealed the covenant. Right, and so maybe that's a possibility too.
Could be. All right. And then he comes back to this for what was being brought to an end. He's already made comment about this just in describing it, but now that's going to be his focal point, the temporary, the transitory nature of this covenant. If what was being brought to an end came with glory, well, then how much more that which is permanent is the idea. And so he's not making a bunch of different points in the text here. He's making a contrast between the old and the new and showing these, I guess, three reasons here as to why the new is so much more glorious than the old. And we can emphasize that just by looking at the text as a whole, by taking a step back. And I've kind of highlighted here all these references to the old, and then we can compare that to these references to the new. Ken noted that my text looked very patriotic here, and just kind of read for the old and the dead and the transitory, and then the blue because it's kind of pleasing, moving forward, that kind of a thing. And so you can really see here a lot of words, which Paul is wont to do. But a lot of words to make this point that this new ministry, the ministry of righteousness, is much more glorious than the old, the ministry of condemnation, of death, this passing ministry. And so that's the first part. Now he's going to build on this, but for the sake of this study, for the sake of the size of the slide, we've divided it into two sections. And so now, Ken, if you don't mind, please read for us 2 Corinthians 3, verses 12 through 18.
Paul continues, since we have such a hope, we're very bold, not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. But their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the old covenant, that same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. And when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit.
All right. He begins by talking about this hope that we have here. And I think it's just a reference to this new ministry. The old covenant was one of death, and this new one is one of life and righteousness. And that's where our hope is. Because of that hope, he says we are very bold. Now, Paul's going to talk about this, or has already talked about this. He asked the question, who is sufficient for something as great as the gospel, which gives life? Who is sufficient for these things? And he goes on to say in chapter 2, verse 16, chapter 3, verses 4 and 5, that he is sufficient, but it's because of Jesus Christ. It's not that Paul has done anything in and of himself. It's complete reliance upon Jesus. He has made us sufficient. Thus, Paul says, I am bold, as he calls out these Corinthians, as he condemns them of sin, as he tells them to fix these things, as he instructs them in the gospel and how to live the life that they should be living.
And this, Jonathan, this may be another kind of help into why Paul is going there. This idea of boldness, boasting, as he'll use throughout this epistle. Is that one of the accusations that were being hurled against him? And Paul is explaining, here's why I'm bold.
Yes.
You and I might stand up in the pulpit and boldly say, what I'm about to tell you is the truth.
Right.
And this will, save your soul. Well, it's not boldness of ourselves, it's of the message. And maybe that's the point here, is he's just explaining his boldness, why I can be so confident in what I'm saying and teaching and even imposing on you, is because unlike Moses, we don't have the veil over the face. We're presenting that gospel that's the truth of God. And as he said in another place, and I'm not ashamed of it.
Yeah. And he's probably annoyed that he's having to make this point a different way, because he really started out First Corinthians making this point, that I came before you and decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I'm not coming to you with worldly wisdom. Well, he's having to cycle back around and make this point again here. I think that's a good point there, Ken. So again, not like Moses. And so we've already started talking about this idea here of from Exodus chapter 34 and what Moses had to do. But what Paul wants to do is bring up this veil issue again, because he's going to make a point. He's going to kind of turn this into an analogy here and use this imagery for what some Jews do when they still read the Old Testament. That Moses used to put the veil over his face so that they might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end, but their minds were hardened, for to this day, when the old covenant is read, that same veil remains unlifted. They are still reading the old covenant through a veil. They're not seeing it clearly. And he accuses them. The reason this is happening is not so much ignorance, but because of a hard heart. Because when they look at Jesus Christ, they reject him. And that was obviously the main accusation there in this part of the first century. And it's only by Jesus Christ that veil is taken away. It is through Jesus Christ that the Old Testament is unlocked. Now, I realize that much of the Old Testament has an original historical meaning as you read through it without thinking of Jesus Christ. Our Jewish friends have been doing it for millennia. But when you see Jesus Christ, for example, what Paul had happen on the road to Damascus, when he comes to understand that Jesus is the Christ, and now he looks back over all that text that he knows so well, that veil was lifted. And Paul is all of a sudden seeing. So Paul is telling them, in many ways, I used to be the same way. But when I understood Jesus Christ, this was removed. And yet, to this day, a veil lies over their heart when they read what Moses had to say. But When one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now, the Lord is spirit, and where the spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Now, I don't know, Ken, what all is being said. Maybe you can help us about why we're emphasizing the Lord is spirit and the spirit of the Lord is there. But I think the point of the freedom that's being mentioned here is as opposed to the death and condemnation of the old ministry, probably because he's talked about the difference between in verse 6, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the spirit. Maybe it's going all the way back to verse 6 there. For the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. And so he's connecting Jesus with the spirit here. Do you think that's the explanation there?
Yeah, absolutely. I see as the contrast there between letter and spirit. And I think, again, you're exactly right with the idea of freedom. Paul uses that language throughout his writings. I think Galatians 5, verse 13, talking about the liberty that we have in Christ, right, as opposed to the bondage that they were under the old law. So yeah, right. I think you're dead on.
Okay, well, good.
I might make one point here, Jonathan.
I knew that was too easy.
I know it is too quick. Kind of outside of the contextual considerations of what we're talking about here, but I see a little bit of a cautionary warning in our biblical interpretation in this section, and I think it's a good section to illustrate. Sometimes people will say, here's a word used here in the Bible, here's a word used here, and it meant this here, and so it must mean the exact same thing here. Right. That's not true. This whole section, think about the tablets of stone, how Paul has kind of just run with that, and it's changed its meaning. Here, the word veil is used in 2 or 3 different kind of ways, metaphorically and literally. And so just because even the same author is using the same word, maybe even in the same context, doesn't mean that it's always means the exact same thing. And we can get caught into that trap somehow. Well, that's the exact same word is used over here, and so it's got to be used the same way with the same meaning. And no.
Well, for instance, what you were just referencing, the veil here could almost refer to the veil in the temple that tore when Jesus died. When one turns to the Lord, at least that would have been an echo in the back of Christians' minds as they read this section here, whether Paul is specifically meaning it or not. You're exactly right here. You can't just always force a definition regardless of context here. And we all with unveiled face, so here we go again, back to the more Mosaic idea of the veil. Here we with unveiled face, because it's been removed. Why? Because we've turned to Jesus Christ. Now we behold the glory of the Lord. We see God more clearly because we have Jesus Christ. We have his son, the image, the icon, I believe is the Greek word there, of God above. And so we can see him with unveiled face. And then maybe I should have just highlighted this whole section together because we are being transformed into the same image. And I can't help but think of 1 John chapter 3, when he talks about, behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed on us, that we can be called sons of God, and we will be like him. We don't yet know what we will be. We haven't seen him yet, but we will see him, and then we will be like him. And how awesome that is going to be. And then we have maybe a little bit of a textual issue, certainly with the ESV here, in the phrasing from one degree of glory to another. And so the idea with the ESV here is that you're going from a lesser degree of glory to a higher degree of glory, maybe. But literally the text, the Greek just says from glory to glory, like in Romans 1, 16, 17, from faith to faith. And so the New American Standard, the New King James, they take this more literal, don't have to insert the interpretation here. Ken, if it doesn't mean from one level of glory to another, what does it mean then from glory to glory?
I think the other possible interpretation would mean from God's glory to our glory.
Okay.
That we're being transformed by his spirit. And so God's glory is what transforms us to our glory. It is a kind of more of a transference rather than a degree of gradation there.
Okay.
But I like the point that he's making here is that, like the argument in the book of Hebrews, he's certainly arguing that the second covenant is greater than the first covenant. But he's also kind of saying, or not kind of, he's saying that we have it better than Moses. Yeah. We, with unveiled face, are beholding. Moses didn't get to see it. We get to see it. Now, not in the literal sense. I'm not looking into the face of God in that sense, but he is saying we get to see the glory of God. That text that you talked about in Exodus 34, Moses didn't. I do. And I'm being transformed into the same image from glory to glory. Moses, the glory, that what I call the heavenly sunburn that he experienced, it diminished. It went away. And I think there's a kind of a passing reference to that earlier. He's actually talking about the covenant that went away. But in the same sense, Moses' glow went away. And maybe, we don't know how, did it just poof, it was gone? Or did it, like a sunburn, did it just kind of slowly fade? Whereas we're going the other direction. Unlike Moses, his glory faded. Ours is getting brighter.
That's a really neat explanation.
Yeah,
that's cool.
We got it better than Moses. Not just as the covenant better than Moses' covenant, we're better than Moses.
And that's saying something when God himself says, I speak with Moses face to face. And so that says something right there. That's pretty good right there. And then we come to this last phrase, for this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. That seems like it should be complicated, but all I can really make of it is just that Jesus Christ makes it possible. He makes this new ministry possible, this new covenant possible. See the book of Hebrews. And so then you see what he has made possible. It is from the Lord Jesus Christ. What do you make out of this last phrase here, Ken?
Well, I think, again, it's the contrast between the old and the new and what was really intended. The old was on tablets of stone. The new is written on our hearts. The old was the letter. The new is the spirit. And so God, like Isaiah and others in the old covenant talk about, God is not some static image. God is not stone. God is spirit. And so this covenant, the second covenant, not the old, which was the covenant of condemnation, the ministry of death, this new covenant better exemplifies who God is, if that's the way of saying it, because he is spirit. And this new covenant is not the letter. It's not on tablets of stone. That's not who God is. It is spirit, because God is spirit and this new covenant is spirit.
I think we do see that we are in the middle of a parenthetical explanation or discussion here as we start chapter 4 next week. Therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart, but we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. You see that and you're like, oh, back to the main point. He's going back to ridiculing whatever's happening in Corinth there. And so I think we do have a bit of a parenthetical here. But we shouldn't be too surprised when Paul starts talking about the sacrifice of Jesus over in Philippians 2. He, to use human language, he seems to get carried away. Peter's going to do the same thing in 1 Peter 2 when he mentions the sacrifice and the suffering of Jesus. And so here, as he has a lot of this rolling around here, he kind of, well, since I've made this comment, let me make this point real quick, and then we can get back to our text, kind of how Paul handles it here. Well, Kim, thank you for your input today. And you will be leading us as we start talking about chapter 4 next Monday. And we hope to see everyone then at 6:30 next Monday night. Hope you have a good one and God bless.